Hello everyone! Today, we're going to use data modding to create a flower pot that gives the player money when they interact with it. We'll start with an existing flower pot asset from the game and add a new interaction to it. By following this tutorial, you'll learn the basic structure behind adding a new interaction to an object and making something happen when that interaction is completed. In a previous data modding tutorial, I explained this structure using a pizza as an example. However, some of you may not have seen that video, so this time I'll explain it again using a restaurant as an example. When you first open the data editor in the ModKit, it may feel a little overwhelming. There are a lot of different tables, and it can be difficult to tell which ones you need or how they are connected. However, you don't need to understand every table for this tutorial. To create this flower pot mod, we'll only be using 5 of them. These 5 tables do not work independently. They are connected in sequence to create a complete interaction. Think about what happens when you visit a restaurant. You look at the menu, choose an item, and place your order. The staff then follows a set process, and eventually the finished dish is served. The data tables are connected in a similar way. First, ObjectTemplate determines which menu the object will use. In this tutorial, this is where we'll connect the interaction menu to the flower pot. Next, ObjectSelectionSet can be thought of as the entire menu. It groups together the interactions that can appear when the player selects the flower pot. InteractionBag is one item listed on that menu. It determines the interaction's displayed name, icon, and the conditions under which it appears. When the player selects that menu item, the action defined in interaction begins. This table determines what the ZOI does, how long the action lasts, and what function is triggered when the action is completed. Finally, script interaction currency represents the actual result, much like the finished dish being served. In this tutorial, we'll use it to give the player money after the interaction is completed. ObjectTemplate identifies the menu used by the flower pot. ObjectSelectionSet loads the list of available interactions. An InteractionBag entry is then displayed to the player. When the player selects it, the corresponding interaction begins. Once that action is completed, script interaction currency runs and gives the player money. However, we won't create the mod in that exact order. Now, let's return to the ModKit. From the home screen, click Build, and then select Included Assets Only. Once you have found the asset, click the arrow on the right and select Create New Mod Project. Next, we'll set up the mod project. For the mod name, I'll enter Cheat Flower Pot. I'll also use the same name for the workspace. Once everything is set, click Create to create the project. Double-click the newly created workspace and wait for the installation to finish. Since we are using an existing asset provided by the game, select Copy when the file handling window appears. Once the installation is complete, close the window and find the Cheat Flower Pot project under Mod Projects. Click the arrow on the right side of the project and then open Data Modding. In this mod, it is important to understand how each piece of data is connected. So let's first prepare the tables we'll need. We'll use script interaction currency to define the currency reward, interaction to connect the ZOI's action to the result, InteractionBag to configure the interaction option displayed to the player, ObjectSelectionSet to group the available interactions, and ObjectTemplate to connect that interaction set to the flower pot. Finally, in this mod, we are duplicating an existing flower pot and turning it into a new item. The duplicated flower pot also inherits the template connection used by the original object. Because of this, we need to open the object table and replace that connection with the new object template we create. Whether you create your own asset or use an existing asset from the game, you still need to connect the correct template in the object table at the end. Now, let's create our first script interaction currency data entry. Enter currency in the source data search bar. Since this interaction will either give or deduct currency, select Script Interaction Currency. You will see several existing entries, including one called Spend Mu. We'll use one of these entries as a base to create our own. Right-click any entry and select Append New Item. For the new ID, I'll enter CFP Spend Mu 1. Once you have entered the ID, click Apply to create the new entry. Now let's expand the entry we just created and take a look at its settings. You can see that command is set to add currency. The F1 field determines the amount of currency that will be added or deducted. For our first interaction, we'll give the player 10,000 mu. Enter 10,000 in the F1 field, and then click Apply to apply the changes. Next, we'll create a second option that deducts mu from the player. Right-click the entry we just created and select Append New Item again. Set the ID for the new entry and enter -100 in the F1 field. When a negative value is used with the Add Currency command, the specified amount is deducted instead of added. Once you have finished, click Apply and then click Save. We now have one data entry that gives the player 10,000 mu and another that deducts 100 mu. Now let's move on to the next step. This time, enter interaction in the source data search bar. Several tables may appear in the search results, but make sure to select the table named exactly interaction. When you open the interaction table, you will see a large number of existing entries. We'll create a new one by duplicating an existing entry. You can use any entry as a base, but I'll use the Move entry for this tutorial. Right-click Move and select Append New Item. For the new ID, enter CFP Add Mu 10,000 Interaction. I added interaction at the end of the ID so that it will be easier to identify later when we connect it to other tables. Once you have entered the ID, click Apply to create the new entry. Now expand the entry we just created. You will see several settings such as Enable Slot Tags, Action ID List, and Inner Thought Icon Info. However, we do not need to modify every setting. We'll only change the parts required for this mod. First, expand Action ID List. This section determines which action the ZOI performs during the interaction. Because we duplicated the Move entry, it currently uses a movement action. However, we do not need that action for this mod. Click the arrow on the far right to view the available actions. You can choose any action you prefer. For this tutorial, I'll simply select Stand. Next, we need to connect this interaction to the currency data we created earlier. This connection is set through Finish Script ID List. However, this value cannot be added directly from the table view, so right-click the JSON panel on the right and select Edit. In the JSON editor, find Finish Script ID List. Enter the ID of the currency entry we created earlier, CFP Spend Mu 1, to connect it to this interaction. Once you have entered the ID, click Commit to apply the changes. Next, create the second interaction in the same way. Duplicate the interaction entry, assign it a new ID, and connect CFP Spend Mu 2 through Finish Script ID List. This connects each currency entry to its own interaction. Finally, do not forget to click Save. The interaction setup, which controls the ZOI's action and the currency result, is now complete. Now, let's set up the interaction bag. The interaction bag table also contains a large number of entries. Just like before, we'll duplicate an existing entry to create a new one. For this tutorial, I'll use the Use Mike Sing entry as the base. Right-click the entry, select Append New Item, and set the new ID to CFP Add Mu 10,000 Bag. When you expand the new entry, you'll see a large number of settings. The most important thing we need to do here is connect the interaction we created earlier to this bag. Our goal is to create a flower pot that adds or removes mu. Because of that, most of the reward and condition settings inherited from the original entry are not needed. Instead of changing every value one by one in the table, it will be much easier to edit the JSON directly. Right-click the JSON panel on the right and select Edit. Follow along carefully and we'll remove everything we do not need. Interaction reward and preference reward are not used in this mod, so delete everything inside them and leave the square brackets empty. As a general rule, unused list fields should be left as empty square brackets, while unused single ID fields should be set to none. For interaction visible condition, IDs delete the values inside the square brackets and leave them empty as well. Set competition rule ID to none. However, we do need to configure interaction sequence. This is where we connect the interaction we created earlier to the interaction bag. Inside interaction sequence, you should see a field called interaction ID. This is where we need to enter the ID of the interaction we created earlier. First, create a new sequence ID, CFP, add mu, 10,000 sequence. Then, enter the interaction ID we created earlier, CFP add mu, 10,000 interaction. Any other sequence settings that are not required for this mod can be removed or left at their default values. Then, enter the interaction ID we created earlier, CFP add mu, 10,000 interaction. Next, we have the settings related to the text IDs. It is easier to register the text through the table view first, and then return to the JSON editor afterward. For now, remove any unnecessary text ID values, or set them to none. We are not using finish script ID here, so delete its contents and leave the square brackets empty. The SLM settings are also unrelated to this mod, so set them to none. Once you have finished cleaning up the JSON, click Commit to apply the changes. Now, scroll down and expand Display Info. This section controls the category and interaction text displayed to the player. Open mod string table for each text ID field. For example, when you open the string table for the category field, you will see all of the registered source strings. For this mod, we need 3 text entries, one for the category name, one for the interaction that adds mu, and one for the interaction that removes mu. Let's create the category name first. Create a key for the category text ID and enter the following as the source string. Before clicking Add, copy the key you just created. You can use it as the base for the next 2 keys, which will help keep the naming consistent. For the next keys, keep the common part of the name and change the ending to identify the purpose of each string, such as add mu and remove mu. Enter the text that you want the player to see for each source string. Once all 3 strings have been added, click the Save icon at the top. Now, right-click the JSON panel again and select Edit. Paste the text ID keys you created into the appropriate fields under Display Info. Enter the category key in the category text ID field, and enter the Add Mu key in the interaction name, Text ID field. Once you are finished, click Commit. This completes the bag for the interaction that adds mu. Now, create the bag for removing mu in the same way. Duplicate CFP add mu 10,000 bag, then change its ID and sequence ID to the names you will use for the remove mu version. Finally, click Apply and then click Save. The interaction bag setup for both adding and removing Mew is now complete. Now let's set up the Object Selection Set. Just like before, we'll duplicate an existing entry to create a new one. For this tutorial, I'll use the click entry as the base. Right-click the click entry and select Append New Item. This time, instead of using the abbreviation CFP, I'll set the new ID to Cheat Flowerpot. After creating the entry Expand Selection Sets, you may see an existing InteractionBag list inherited from the original entry. We do not need those interaction bags for this mod. Right-click the JSON panel on the right and select Edit. Remove all of the existing entries from the InteractionBag list and replace them with the two bag IDs we created earlier. One should be the bag that adds Mew, and the other should be the bag that removes Mew. Once you have entered both IDs, click Commit to apply the changes. Now expand Selection Sets again. Select each row and click the arrow on the right to confirm that both InteractionBag entries have been connected correctly. Once everything looks correct, click Save. Next, let's set up the Object Template. When you open the Object Template table, you'll see a large number of entries. The flower pot we are using is based on the existing pot02 template. Because of that, the easiest approach is to duplicate that template and use it as our base. Enter pot02 in the search bar and locate the correct entry. Right-click it and select Append New Item. Set the new ID to Cheat Flowerpot Template. The main field. We need to change here is ObjectSelectionSet ID. Enter the ID we created earlier, Cheat Flowerpot. This connects our new object selection set to the flowerpot template. Once the connection has been made, click Save. Now we only have the object table left. When you open the object table, you should see that the flowerpot object has already been created under the name pot02. This is because we created the project by duplicating an existing flowerpot asset provided by the game, so its object data was included automatically. Because of this, we do not need to create a new object entry. We only need to replace its existing template connection with the template we just created. Find ObjectTemplate ID and change its value to Cheat Flowerpot. Template check. Once more that the new template has been connected correctly, and then click Save. All of the data connections are now complete. Let's return to the mod home screen and package the mod. Find the mod project we created and click the arrow on the right. Then select Create Local Mod Package. Once the packaging process is complete, launch inZOI and check whether the flowerpot interactions are working correctly.